All right, this is Openstax US History, Chapter 4, Section 2, The Glorious Revolution and the English Empire. So in this section, we're moving from the rule of Charles II, who you'll recall is the Restoration King, and we're moving to James II, who was his brother. Here is James pictured here, looking pretty fancy. And James II is the same James who was the former Duke of York. This guy was in charge of the New York colony when it passed to England's hand from the Dutch. And James's goal is to assert absolutist rule of the monarch and to reimpose Catholicism. Now, this puts James in a pretty tricky place because it essentially puts him at odds with Parliament. Right? And not just Parliament, the colonies as well. And the colonies typically have parliaments back in any type of conflict between the monarch and Parliament, at least in these early decades, right? Or 1600s, early 1700s. Certainly not when you get to the Revolutionary era. And one of the ways that King James puts himself at odds with the colonies, especially, is his creation of the Dominion of New England. And what the Dominion of New England is that it combined the New England colonies, and we'll just say, and New York and New Jersey, in parentheses here, into one single colony. All right, so the Dominion of New England was taking all those New England colonies, Massachusetts, Plymouth, Connecticut, New Hampshire, combining it with New York, combining it with New Jersey, and just creating one single colony. Now, from the perspective of James and the British Empire, this, it makes sense. Why have a bunch of different little colonies that are all slightly different in sort of their religious orientations with different laws, different customs, et cetera, Let's just make one single colony and make it easier to rule. Sir Edmund Andros was appointed as governor of the Dominion. So we might say of Sir Edmund Andros, governor. We'll just say Dominion of New England for short. And this was, as you might imagine, let's actually use stronger language here, not just not well liked. We'll actually say this was hated. Use red here because the colonists were seeing red. Hated by the colonists, right? They wanted their own political power back. And so the colonists, especially in New England, became, very, you could say they became enemies of James. Now, within James II, there was this fear that it might, devolve into another English Civil War. Would this be the English Civil War Part 2? We have a king who's trying to exercise more absolutist rule, who leans towards Catholicism, puts them at odds with Parliament, a group of nobles who also want power. Parliament tends to be much more Protestant as well. However, war was avoided in an event known as the Glorious Revolution. And the reason why it's glorious was because it was a bloodless revolution. In other words, James II, instead of raising his own army and trying to fight Parliament like Charles I did, he just ran away, right? He just simply gave up his throne. He learned the lesson of Charles I, who was beheaded by Parliament, didn't want that same fate. He simply just ran away. Instead, the Protestant rulers, William III and Mary, just sometimes referred to as William and Mary, became the new Protestant monarchs of England. So we might say in the Glorious Revolution, William and Mary they came from the Netherlands over to England. The new Protestant, again, religion was important. Monarchs of England. And of course, this William and Mary would have been supported by the colonists. Those who opposed James II were called Whigs. So Whigs were those who opposed King James II. Right, so people who opposed the king. And as a result, this dominion, which was again, hated by the colonists, eventually was dissolved. So many of the colonies got back their charters. Some didn't. So, for example, the Plymouth colony ceased to exist. It was instead with the Massachusetts colony. The colony of New Haven ceased to exist. But you had the recreation of Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Hampshire, New York, New Jersey. All those colonies got their political power back. So the Glorious Revolution, in the eyes of most colonists, was a good thing, right? A very good thing. It was in the aftermath of this Glorious Revolution that definitions about English liberty became, what you might say, maybe much more pronounced, especially in the aftermath of, once again, the monarch being defeated, and really what it meant for Parliament to rule and what it meant for the English subjects within the empire and the relationship with Parliament. In 1689, Parliament wrote the English Bill of Rights, which listed the various rights of both members of Parliament and English subjects. So some of the ones that we might take note of: Parliament protected the right to speech, election, right? This is important when it comes to representative government, right? The opposite of absolute monarchy, the right to petition. English subjects secured the right to trial by jury and habeas corpus. Habeas corpus really means you can't just be thrown in jail for no reason. Charges need to be brought against a person for jail. Probably a much shorter and better way of putting that, but that's what we got, right? You can't just arbitrarily imprison someone. That's probably a better way of putting it. It was in the aftermath of the Glorious Revolution that probably the most influential English writer began authoring his ideas, which would later go on and influence the shaping of not just the colonies, but the United States of America, and that was John Locke. John Locke, we'll call him, I'll say this, the most important English, and we'll learn this term later on, Enlightenment writer. And he published the two treaties of government, which sort of outlined some of the ideas of what it means for a government to rule over its subjects. In fact, John Locke would reject that sentence that I just said. Rather than subjects being ruled over by a parliament or by a specific monarch, John Locke would argue that government is a contract, right? So we sometimes call this the social contract. In other words, you take the government on the one hand, whatever type of government it is, parliament in this case, and you take the people on the other hand, and the two are bounded together by a contract, right? Social contract. And essentially, in Locke's view, the government is responsible for protecting people's rights, life, liberty, and according to John Locke, property. And in return, people pay their taxes and give up some of their rights to the government. The whole point is that, like any other contract, if either side violates that contract, that is, if a government does not protect people's life, liberty, or property, or in other ways violates the rights of its citizens, that contract is null and void. And like Thomas Jefferson would go on later to say, people have the right to alter or abolish it. So you can definitely see how these ideas, this right here is just, this is where Thomas Jefferson simply just plagiarized for the Declaration of Independence. They're John Locke's words. So these ideas become very important. John Locke also rejects divine right. Divine right is the theory that God put kings on earth to rule. Now, this wasn't the case in England, but this was the case in places like Spain, and France, right? They were absolute monarchs. This is what James II was trying to be. James II wanted to copy the monarchs of Spain and France who had absolute power. To define or defy the king of France or defy the king of Spain was, simply like defying God. It would not be accepted there. Other laws included the English Toleration Act, which led to more religious toleration. Not in a modern sense, but religious toleration for nonconformist Protestants. Right? So, for example, some of the smaller Protestant denominations like the Baptists, like other Congregationalists who were previously shunned by groups like the Church of England, those Protestant groups were more well accepted. Catholics were still not, Catholics and Jews and other religious minorities, not really toleration for them, but mostly we want to think about this law as being toleration for all Protestant or many Protestant denominations.